All right, can audio coming through? All right, I've just got a thumbs up from a couple of people in the office here. Awesome. So look, afternoon everyone. Thanks for joining. Oh, hold on a moment. All right, we're just going to wait one more minute just to give everyone a chance to jump in. What we will do just while we're waiting is I'm just going to flick here. We're just going to run a few polls throughout the webinar just to get a bit of an insight and understanding of the audience and various qualifications and experience. So I'm just going to flick through here. First one's pretty straightforward. So the poll should come up via the webinar, go to webinar widget. So if you hold a valid REPL license, so you'll have an option for yes or no there. So you want to just plug in the answer and just give us a bit of an understanding there of the audience. Awesome. So I think we've got a pretty good engagement there. So we'll move on to the next one. So this should just flick back over. Awesome. All right. Thanks everyone for joining. As I said, we'll be running through a few polls throughout there, just a bit of an idea. So awesome to keep that engagement up now. To give you a bit of an introduction, my name's Alex Kondilios. I'm the Business Development Manager here at Sphere Drones. I've been with the business for over 3 years, starting back in 2016, and sort of seen the business transition from a team of less than half a dozen working mainly B2C and consumer drones to a team of over 20 in 2 states, both on the east and west coast, and dealing with primarily commercial and enterprise clients. So yeah, on the other side, we've got Rowan Kimber. Now, I know that we had put in a lot of the marketing material that Ross Anderson wouldn't be joining us, but we made a decision that it'd probably best for Rowan to join. Rowan's a RPAS Regulations and Operations Specialist, as you can see at Aviassist. He's been there for almost 3 years, but he's got over 20 years of experience in the aviation industry. He's a corporate lawyer by background, specialising in aviation law. And he is the lead within Aviassist when it comes to everything regulation and legislation-wise from a BVLOS perspective. So we're really privileged to have Rowan join us. And so I thank him for making the time out of his day. Also, thank you to everyone else for taking the time, obviously in uncertain and challenging times for everyone. Appreciate you all, take the time to join us, and hopefully you all get some great value out of this. Just to give you a bit of an overview, just a quick introduction. We'll then jump into Rowan's side of things. We'll go through BVLOS and the Australian legislation around that. We'll jump into what it looks like gaining an approval and operating BVLOS in Australia. We'll look at a couple of success stories and use cases that Aviassist have been through with customers in the country. What the future of BVLOS looks like. Also touching on EVLOS as an alternative. And then we will go through a summary and range of costs, finishing up with a Q&A at the end. So we'll try to leave about 10-15 minutes for Q&A, and we encourage you to send your questions through during the webinar. There is an option, obviously, on that widget where you can put all your questions in, and we'll do our best to attend to as many of those as possible, and those that we can't get to, we'll follow up after the session. Now, to just give those of you a bit of an understanding of Sphere Drones and our capabilities, obviously we provide sales of both drone and software, but we do much more than that: repair and maintenance, training, consulting, rental support, and more recently enterprise agreements, which you'll see coming out over the next couple months. So watch this space in that regard. Our service footprint. We started in Sydney 3 to 4 years ago. 3 to 7 years ago, we started in Sydney. And last year, we opened an office in Perth. So you can see the way that we're set up strategically to service both the east and west coast. Second question, just to get an understanding, does your business hold an RPA Operator Certificate, or more commonly referred to as an REOC? So that question should pop up now. So if you wouldn't mind, yeah, just answering that, just to give us a bit of an understanding. Awesome, I'm just looking to see. All right, we've got I think almost 90% of people have answered that, so appreciate that. Yeah, good to go. Thanks for everyone jumping in on that. So look, without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Rowan. Obviously, that's the reason why you've all tuned in today, and he'll take you through, yeah, as I said, all the points mentioned in the agenda there. So yeah, without further ado, Rowan.
Beautiful. Thank you, Alex, and thanks everyone for coming in today. As Alex said, it's pretty challenging times at the moment for everyone. I'm sure every business is having some interesting things to go through. So we certainly appreciate you taking out the time to come and be at the webinar. The good thing with doing the webinar is there's no chance of catching the coronavirus through the internet, so we're all pretty safe with that one. So let's just as an introduction to Aviassist. As Alex introduced, my name is Rowan. I'm the in-house counsel for Aviassist. I handle all the regulatory work for the company internally and externally. So all the consulting work, BVLOS approvals above 400 feet, mostly all the CASA liaison work, as well as work on operator certificates and complex approvals. So Aviassist, we're exclusively a remote piloted company now. We were started doing piloted aviation. So Ross, our director, started the company doing piloted aviation and then moved over to remote piloted when it became pretty obvious that that was the future of drone operations. Of aviation operations in Australia. So now we employ a team of mostly ex-pilots, actually, mostly commercial pilots, helicopter pilots and fixed-wing pilots throughout the country, working predominantly in remote pilot's license training and consultancy roles. So one of the key differences that Aviassist does is that we don't compete with our clients. We don't believe in it. So you'll never see Aviassist out there quoting on jobs that compete against you guys as far as the work that you do. That's not what we're here for. Our ethos and our motto is that we're here to help you guys fly, and that's what we do. So in that, there's four main areas of the business. So obviously there's a big part of what we do is our remote pilot licensing training. We're running courses every week throughout the country, pretty standard as far as how the remote pilot license training courses go. We do a lot of remote operator certificate work. So we do a lot of helping people get to their remote operator certificate, building out their manual suite, but also some consulting work with chief pilots. So we know how daunting it can be for new people to come on board as a chief pilot. So we do a lot of work with future chief pilots and making sure that they're ready, not just to pass the delegates test, and anyone that's been through it can see that there's different standards of delegates test and there's different standards of chief pilots. But what's more important to us is that we're developing a safe future for aviation and safe future for drones. We've all seen what it's like in general aviation at times where it's not as good as what it could have been, and we're trying to make sure that the drones does things differently. So we spend a lot of time mentoring future chief pilots to make sure that they're what they should be in the industry. Obviously, on the other side of the slide, we've got our auditing work. So we're doing auditing work largely to make sure people are compliant in preparation for approvals that they get. So it's really important when you try to go and get an approval with CASA, such as a BVLOS, that all your T's are crossed and all your I's are dotted. If they're not, the wheels are going to come off pretty quickly. So usually the start of any of a BVLOS process, we get out there and we audit either as a desktop or a face-to-face audit. It's a good chance for an operator to see where they're sitting, where they're going. It's one of those things that I'm sure most people would appreciate, that it's really easy inside an organisation to think that you're trekking along right and that you're doing everything right. You get a bit of a fog that that you as an operator are A-OK, and it's not until someone that's unbiased and fresh eyes comes in that shows that, hang on, there's a couple of things you can work on. So we work with operators in trying to help their compliance, help their safety, and also ultimately drive better profits in our auditing. And then lastly is the consulting work. So the work that we're going to be talking about today, things like getting BVLOS approvals or getting EVLOS approvals, all the regulatory work with CASA, which is where certainly I in particular do most of the work with Aviassist. We work really hard with the regulator. We've got a really close relationship with the regulator, and in turn, that's the sort of stuff that you guys get when we do approvals for people. They get the benefit of the fact that we've seen it all before, largely at least, and we've got a pretty good relationship with them. So let's get into what we're actually here to do today, if this system works, which I think it will. Look at that, the system works. All right, so just briefly to talk about the legislation, I intend to personally take this as a compulsory professional development point for my lawyer work, so I have to in that tell you something about the law, so let's have a bit of a chat about it. Civil Aviation Safety Regulations, 1998, Regulation 101.073, we've got operations must be generally within visual line of sight. It goes through and says that a person commits an offence of strict liability if a person operates an unmanned aircraft and the aircraft is not operated within the person's visual line of sight. And then the regulations go on to talk about an exemption effectively for that, which says sub-regulation 1 does not apply if the person holds an approval under regulation 101.029 to operate the unmanned aircraft beyond the person's visual line of sight. So the system's set up there that generally everyone has to operate visual line of sight, but there is a regime set up to do that. And I've just snuck up in the top right hand corner there the penalty unit. So just to give you an idea of how serious CASA takes this rule, the penalty unit at the moment is about $210. So you're looking at about a $10.5 grand fine that CASA could issue if they wanted to, or 10 grand in the conviction for this if you were to breach this rule. So they take it pretty seriously, and it looks like they're going to be doing that more so, particularly with BVLOS and EVLOS bring more into the fore. So we'll move on to the next slide. All right, so we've got another poll there. Alex, you're right to set up that poll. All right, so just a quick question before we get into more of the regulations, just based on what we've had a quick look at. Which of the following items are permitted under CASA 101.275, so the visual line of sight provisions, without further approval? So have a look at those, see if we can get some answers, then we'll have a quick chat about them. Rightio, and as those come in, we'll start moving on to the next slide. Got quite a few answers there. Great, I'm just waiting for the numbers to come up on my end. I won't show you the next poll just yet, because that'd be cheating a little bit. All right, so interesting split of people. I'm very impressed with the very small percent on a couple of those, but largely everyone agreed essentially with what I say with this one. And I will say right at the outset, one thing I have to say that I'm obliged to say is that this isn't legal advice and shouldn't be taken as legal advice. There's a disclaimer, you can't sue me for any of this. But the reason I say that is that aviation legislation, anyone who's been around it will notice that it's drafted in a very peculiar way. There is more grey than there is black and white. Not only that, we have a real issue in aviation that we don't have much in the way of case law that's been set down by courts. It's not normally the way CASA handles their infringements and their enforcement procedure. And as a result of that, a lot of what we go through here is our best guess as to what we're going to do. I've spent a lot of time and a lot of money studying and working in statutory interpretation. I've got a pretty good idea about the way courts are going to interpret things, but in saying that, everyone's got their own opinion, and I welcome those. When we get to the questions and answers, I certainly welcome if someone's got a different interpretation of this, and let's air it out and let's have a bit of a chat. But if we go down to the meaning of operated within visual line of sight, so unmanned aircraft is operated within visual line of sight if the person operating the aircraft can continually see, orient, and navigate. So at those questions, there was the momentary operation behind a tree, and that was favoured by quite a few people that you could do that. Arguably, the word continually knocks that out as something you can't do. I'm impressed that for the most part, people didn't think you could use first-person view goggles. There is quite a lot of FPV use in Australia. As you know, that just because it's not necessarily legal doesn't mean it doesn't happen. There's quite a lot of it. At the moment, CASA's leaving it alone, but I suspect that's going to change in future. Not many people say that you can, but my reading of the word continually says that you can't. But most of all there, you've got the spotter requirement. And I wanted to talk about this concept of a spotter. There's nothing in the legislative regime as it stands at the moment that allows the use of the spotter for beyond visual line of sight operations as an exemption from 101 inherently in the reg. So everything requires you to get an approval if you intend to use a spotter to change your safety. So whilst I'm a big advocate of using spotters for your operations, I think they're an important part of the safety, and anyone who's operating a REOC should have a really rigorous system for inducting spotters and using spotters. From a legislative point of view, everything rests on the remote pilot, and so everything's written in a way that says the remote pilot is the one who has to see it, orient and navigate it. So we'll move on from there, and we've got one more poll. When we look at what we can, so we have to see, orient, and navigate the aircraft to meet our separation and collision avoidance responsibilities, with or without corrective lenses, but without binoculars, a telescope, or a similar device. So given that, something like a Phantom 4, pretty popular aircraft, we've got another poll there about what you think the visual line of sight range in open air would be Phantom 4 on a blue sky day. So just want to answer those polls. So this is a really, really technical question and quite a misunderstood question. The reason it's so misunderstood is that no one really knows what the test is for what visual line of sight is. Not only that, obviously we don't have much in the way of court cases for it, but also my eyesight's going to be different to the next person, it's going to be different to the next person. I put there blue sky day, but even with a blue sky day doesn't mean we're not going to have any atmospheric disturbances with that. We don't know exactly what angle the sun's going to be sitting, what's going to be hitting the aircraft. Was it a white phantom? Was it a black phantom? All of these are going to be impacts that then affect what visual line of sight is. So out of that, we got 18% of people went for the number of 140. I'm particularly impressed that no one said that a Phantom could be VLOS at 1120. I'm sure we're all agreeing that no one's ever operated at beyond 1120, and everything you see on YouTube is fake. 1120, we didn't have many people, but so the bulk of people said 280, and I'd have to say I probably agree that that's probably what it is, somewhere between that and the 560 mark. We had 18% of people say it was 140, and it's a really interesting figure only because just recently a gentleman at the regulator who was working on some above 400 foot approvals proffered that that was the correct figure for a Phantom. That in fact that was the figure for a Phantom and a Matrice 210. The visual line of sight's 140 meters, and where this came out and the big push for BVLOS as a result of that was the question was raised to CASA, well, what's the test for visual line of sight? How do you actually go and demonstrate what it is? And we couldn't get a consensus with CASA and industry as to whether or not you could maneuver the aircraft, whether or not you had to be holding the controls at the time, or whether or not you'd watched it the whole time. So time will tell how that goes, but for you guys, doesn't really matter because we're gonna skip over that and go straight into beyond visual line of sight. So just want to have a quick chat about how the beyond visual line of sight approval system works. I'm conscious that we don't have much time today, so I'm gonna brush over some of this. We're gonna start with the remote pilot license licensing requirements. So obviously to have a BVLOS approval, first thing you need is a remote operator certificate. So you have to be a company that's, an entity that holds a REOC. For a whole bunch of liability reasons, then you will choose a particular structure, but certainly you need to have a REOC to do this. Anyone that doesn't have one, I suggest get out and get it as soon as possible, particularly if you move into BVLOS. Because one of the things that the regulator looks at when they're looking at BVLOS is the company's or the entity's history in their standard operations. So it's really difficult to go to CASA, and we've had this come up a few times recently. It's really difficult to go to CASA and say, look, we've got this operator here and they want to do a really, really complex BVLOS operation over, let's say, a pipeline in a metropolitan area beyond visual line of sight, and they've had their remote operator certificate for a month. And CASA says they've what? And we sit there and try and explain to them that this is a really good operator and they've got lots of track record, but because they didn't have their remote operator certificate, because they were operating in the excluded category, we couldn't show them the data that we wanted to show them as far as how they do their maintenance records, how they do their incident reporting, their retention of records, their pilot training, their commitment to professionalism. So anyone that doesn't have a remote operator certificate, I strongly recommend, regardless of what you plan to do, get your REOC as soon as you can so you can start building that corporate culture and that corporate history with CASA. It's going to go a long way. So as far as the remote pilot goes, so obviously you've got your remote operator certificate, then the pilots need to be trained and hold a remote pilot's license. To actually manipulate the controls or to be the pilot of the operation, and it's been clarified by CASA just recently, you need to have, the pilot needs to have at least one of the following exams. So it's either an aeronautical exam for the instrument rating under Part 61, or the former instrument rating theory exam IRX under Part 5 of the Civil Aviation Regulations. So people would know this as the IRX exam. Both A and B there are the IRX exam. So I'll just have a quick look at the IRX exam. It's not a particularly easy exam, and we'll be honest about that. There's one more poll, I think is all I've got. So sorry about asking all the polls, but it's pretty handy to tailor the webinar. So if we can just get one answer on who's got an IRX pass. All right, so we've got some people coming in straight away that do have an IRX pass. And so for those people who have someone in their operation that has an instrument rating theory exam pass, hold on to them. They are very, very, very valuable to your organisation at the moment. It's quite difficult to get the exam, and once you've got it, it's a really handy thing to have. So those guys that have got an IRX, good on you. It is in aviation very much a rite of passage to hold the IRX exam, and so those guys who have gone through and got it, congratulations. And when you're looking for your pilots, it's something that maybe if you go through, you might want to have a look at. So there's a little cartoon there that gives you a bit of an idea of the way we see about the IRX. We've got a theory exam today. I hope it was an easy one. Does your exam paper let out an evil laugh when you open it? And that's very much what most people see as the IRX exam. It's a pretty tricky one to tackle. So it's a 40-question exam, 3.5 hours, 70% pass mark, and you need at least 2 weeks preparation as the absolute minimum to get through the IRX exam. Realistically, self-studying is not a good option with the IRX. It's pretty difficult, and there's a lot of curly things in it. It's one of those things that was designed for piloted aviation, and it has a lot of things that aren't relevant to remote pilot. So it's handy to see someone that can give you a bit of an idea of how it works. By example, I think I've got a question here that is a sample instrument rating question. So it talks about thunderstorms, it talks about equipment requirements in your piloted aircraft, it talks about weather information services, and then it wants to know the lowest meteorological minima for a straight-in instrument approach to runway 27. So obviously there's a lot there that is well beyond and outside what we do for remotely piloted aviation, and just simply not relevant. And it makes it pretty difficult for remote pilots to get through the exam. I found this when I was doing it, at least, that it made it a lot easier if you were going to do it if you had done some flying. So anyone who is looking at doing the IRX exam, certainly have a chat to Sphere, have a chat to us. We do training for that. It's a really good thing to do, and it will for a long time be the pinnacle when it comes to doing beyond visual line of sight operations. But it's not necessarily going to be your only operation. So there was CASA put out an advisory circular, and in their advisory circular, they listed there was one other type of exam that you could do. They snuck it right down the bottom and didn't say much about it, but it says an approved examination for this purpose. So we've been working with CASA as well as a few other operators at the moment in what we can do at the CASA working group to draft a framework for an alternate exam procedure that doesn't include things that it's just simply irrelevant for IRX, for beyond visual line of sight operations. So where the working group is at the moment is above 400-foot BVLOS operations at this stage will stay with an IRX requirement. CASA are using this as essentially a cliff there, that if you can't meet the burden, that there's a hurdle requirement. If you can't meet it, you shouldn't be playing in the big game. And then underneath that, they're saying, look, if you're below 400 feet where you're not really mixing with piloted aircraft, then they'll allow a theory and practical training course provided by an approved remote training facility, so such as Aviassist. It looks like that course at this stage will be about a 1-week course. It'll be both practical and theory, and all the non-relevant content from the IRX is replaced with the RPAS specific content. So we're all looking forward to that. Should come in sometime in the next few months, but it's something that's been working on for a couple of years now. So with everything else that's going on with the MOS transition, it could take a while. So on to actually getting an approval to operate BVLOS. Obviously, there's a lot of paperwork requirement that goes into it. And this is all built around what they call the JARIS Sora. So the Joint Authorities for Rulemaking on Unmanned Systems is JARIS, and they made a system called Sora. So Sora is a methodology, a risk methodology used to determine whether an operation can be conducted in a safe manner. So it's a specific operational risk assessment. And so CASA is one of the 61 countries that's involved in this, and they've adopted that as a primary methodology to be used on complex operations, which includes BVLOS operations. So we're using it for things like above 400-foot approvals. We're using it for some of our more complex operations in controlled airspace or operating in restricted airspace where it's really complicated, or we're operating near sensitive equipment. But certainly BVLOS is one of the big ones that we're using it for. So I'm just going to do a quick overview of what the Sora process is. This isn't intended to be a Sora masterclass. There's quite a lot in it. And I only really want to talk for another 10 or 15 minutes so that we can get onto questions. But I just want to give you a bit of an idea of what's in it. So basically the Sora methodology, you've got 10 systematic steps. Step 1, you do a ConOps description, so your concept of operations, and then from there you're going to do a determination of a ground risk class. So you look at all the risks that are going to be on the ground for your operation intrinsically. You then look at treating those ground risks and determine what a final ground risk class is. So we're going to look at things like parachutes, that sort of thing, to treat that ground risk. From there, you determine your initial air risk class. You look at strategic mitigation for the air risk class to try and reduce those and determine a residual air risk class. You'll look at what tactical mitigation performance requirements and robustness levels you'll need. So this will be things to do with how the airspace is managed, whether or not you've got radar systems, just to avoid the chances of a mid-air collision. From there, everything goes down and we get what we call a SAIL, so a specific assurance and integrity level. And this is essentially a grading number that says how risky is your operation. And that grading number then drives what you need to do for your operational safety objectives. And we're going to go through these in just a moment. But basically, they're a set of what the minimum requirements are that every operator has to do, and then grades how robust their requirements are, their responses to those. Step 9, we look at adjacent area and airspace. So CASA is not just concerned about you crashing within your area of operations. I want to have a look at what your impact is going to be if you have a link loss, for instance, and we'll talk about this with some of the more specific approvals. But if you have a link loss on a flyaway, where's the aircraft going to go and what the impact's going to be? And then finally, with that, you put it all together and develop a comprehensive safety portfolio that goes off to CASA with your application form. So just basically, if we're looking at an intrinsic ground risk class, this is the way the system works. So we calculate out the kinetic energy of the remotely piloted aircraft based on the standard operations and the terminal velocity, factoring things like wind and meteorological conditions, whether or not the aircraft's in P mode or A mode, how the aircraft's to be operated during that area, wingspan, mass of the aircraft, looking at that and then calculate out a terminal velocity. And then from that terminal velocity, we feed it back into this table. And this table gives us a figure of what our initial risk class for that operation is. And this is where we're going to start with our whole operation. So as you can see there, beyond visual line of sight, in a sparsely populated environment, the minimum risk category for ground risk is number 3. And 3 is actually pretty high. So obviously it can get a lot higher than that, but 3 as a starting point drives a SAIL level that's not a particularly low SAIL level. So one of the things that we want to do with our BVLOS is we might be able to accept a 3, but certainly a 5 or an 8, we start to get into some really difficult issues with what that's going to drive as our final result for our aircraft. So from that, we're going to work on how we reduce it. So we treat the ground risks to reduce the risk and derive our final ground risk class, which in turn is going to drive that final SAIL. Bit of an interesting thing with this particular step though, it is very much cart before the horse. So the SAIL system is a risk rating process. So without a thorough understanding of the scoring system, you end up doing unnecessary treatments in your earlier stage. So when you really understand the Sora process, you'll understand that, look, for some operations, a ground risk of 3 or 4 or 5 may not matter at all because reducing it won't impact your overall SAIL level at the end of the process. And so this is about doing an initial assessment and then maybe coming back to this towards the end. And this is certainly where you want to have a really good understanding of Sora to save yourself a lot of heartache as you go through. There's no point going and buying a whole parachute system and testing that when ultimately it's not going to make any difference to the safety of your operation. Right, so step number 4, we start to move to air risk class, and it's a little bit difficult to see there, but basically you've got a chart that runs through what a generalized density is based on traffic environment. So the initial air risk class assumes that every airspace operates in the same way. And so we run through, for instance, and say we're doing operations in a heliport environment is yes, we're not doing operations in a controlled airspace, so we end up with an ARC category of C, so an air risk categorization of C. This is all based on a generalized density. With our generalized density, however, that's not necessarily going to be reflective of the system. Sora was created by countries all around the world. A lot of countries don't have what we have in Australia. We've got a pretty unique aviation environment. Certainly when you go out to the outback, there's not much going on there. We've got some interesting challenges that relates with radio use and other things, but from a traffic point of view, the density in those areas just simply doesn't match to what else is going on. And so for those sort of things, we're going back in and we might argue to CASA politely, of course, to say, well, look, the density, we've done a traffic assessment on this particular area, and our traffic assessment on this area shows that our density is actually much lower than what it is, or in some places, our density is higher than what it is, and we need to make sure we go back to CASA with that. CASA are particularly good at knowing when you're lying about things. They're particularly good if you try and pull the wool over their eyes at knowing that you're doing it and then dealing with your approval appropriately, which is usually it's filed in a round filing cabinet. And so it's obviously really important that we want to be honest with this as we go through it. So this might, depending on what you're doing, and we had an operation that we had to do a couple of months ago where we were operating in a Sora environment where we were between a restricted airspace, a quite busy airport, and a mountain range. And that depending on the height of our operations, so these were upper level operations, depending on the height of our operations, we would impact on the restricted airspace, would impact on air traffic flow. And so one of the things that we did there was had a look at the terrain and had a look at the traffic flow over time, spoke to the local pilots in the area, and realised that the terrain that was around the area actually forced a funnel that pilots would only fly a particular way from a safety point of view, that if they were ever flying low, they would never fly in this particular area. And so we were able to do up certifications for that and add that into our client's application pack to go back to CASA. And in doing that, reduce what our air risk class was to something that was much more manageable over the entire process. So that's the sort of thing you're looking at with your air risk mitigation profile. So once you've done your air risk mitigation, I'll just get my my mouse back. All right, there we go. So the other part of this, apart from looking at air density, is that the Sora process allows us to look at what strategies we can put in that are under the control of the pilot to change whether or not we're likely to impact things. So some of these things are really simple things, like looking at chronology, looking at what time the traffic density is there. If you're operating near an airport that is a private airport for mining operations, for instance, then often we can get around a lot of this air risk categorization by showing that we know what the schedules are of the aircraft, we know when the pilot's going to be coming in and out, and we can put in some procedures about contacting airport reporting officers and a bunch of other work there so that we can reduce that air risk category just by saying we're not going to fly within a certain amount of time. So, or we're going to put no-fly areas in certain approach paths. We know where the instrument approach paths are, for instance, for these particular airports. And so those areas, when meteorological conditions are such, then we won't fly in those areas. So it's sort of things that you need to look at when you're running through that area. All right. So on to step number 6, tactical mitigation performance requirements and robustness levels. So this is in Annex D of Sora. There's 2 classifications of tactical mitigation, namely for our operations, BVLOS, where an alternate means of mitigation to human vision, as in machine or machine assistance is applied to remain well clear and avoid collisions from other aircraft. So this is looking at things like, do we put a radar system in? Do we have ADS-B? Those people who have been around aviation in Australia for a while will know that our ADS-B system isn't as robust as what it could be because of some unfortunate policy decisions that were made in the piloted space. And so unfortunately, just carrying ADS-B doesn't really cut it for the traffic that we've got to avoid. But there are some other things. So detect and avoid is a big thing in this, and we're looking at what things can we use to detect and avoid. And for some of our operations, it'll be something as simple as, do we use a radio? What are our radio requirements? But then if we are going to use a radio, how do we make sure when our aircraft is 10 kilometres away that our base station is going to reach the range that it needs to do? And what do we need to put in process to make sure that the pilots that are likely to hit the aircraft are going to hear our radio calls when we make them? Or if we're operating in a built-up environment, do we need to operate in controlled airspace where we can rely on air traffic control to do our separation that knows the other aircraft? Or do we put in our own radar system? And all of this is going to be driven based on how risky your operation is. The more risk your operation is, you want to go and operate in the centre of Melbourne CBD on a beyond visual line of sight operation, you can be pretty sure that you're going to end up having some pretty high requirements on you. But if you want to operate in the middle of 100 nautical miles north of Alice Springs, for instance, then the likelihood of a radar, certainly sub 400 feet, is just not likely going to happen. So once all this is finished, it goes into step number 7. It's a determination of specific assurance and integrity levels. Your numbers go in here. This drives a table that ends up then driving what you have to do as a result of this. So these are what they call the operational safety objectives. And from our SAIL level, it tells us whether we need to have a low, medium, or high, or optional level of integrity and robustness for each one of these things. So these are things like UAS maintained by a competent or proven entity. So for some operations, you can have a low, which doesn't have to have much, but if you want to go and operate in a more complex environment, then you might have an aircraft that has to be certified, for instance, or has to have a certain amount of redundancies, just depending on what happens. Same thing for the C3 link, the command control link performance, looking at weather ingress, those sorts of things. So this is where it gets to the level of integrity and insurance, and the table will go through and say, for instance, OSO2 manufactured, you might need to have the aircraft with manufacturing process, personnel competencies and qualifications, supplier control. So basically full piloted aviation sort of work. Once you've done that, you look at the adjacent airspace to see what's going on in the adjacent air and ground areas, see if you need to do anything with those. Basically, the system's set up so that you should be able to ensure that you're not going to hit anything, you're not going to use that area, and if you are, we're going to add buffer zones. Once it's done, we go for the comprehensive safety portfolio. So ConOps, justification, ready calculations, airspace details, traffic density, how you calculated out your traffic density, what your evidence is, ground risk, density data on ground risk, for instance, how you calculated it, how reliable is it, whether or not it's a controlled ground area for a lot of these operations, evidence for any claims that you do on your operational safety objectives. You've got to cross-reference all your operational documentation to show that you can do these, and then any third-party assessments. So one that comes up quite a lot is the human machine interface, the HMI assessment, where we're going to have to, or whoever's doing it is going to have to do an assessment on whether or not the machine interface works. Which brings an interesting point when it comes to choice of aircraft. So it's really important to know that not all RPAs are suitable for BVLOS operations. We were doing some work for a client recently where they were doing a pretty complex operation over pipelines, where they were going to have to cross A-class roads, so pretty serious roads. And unfortunately, we had a couple of issues in that their aircraft simply didn't have the redundancies in the aircraft that would mean that they could safely cross that over without breaching any of the populous area rules. But also the human machine interface simply didn't pass the test. So the human machine interface they were using was so complex, with so much data given to the pilot, that it made the pilot task saturated, and as a result, the pilot couldn't safely operate that aircraft and they couldn't pass the human machine interface test. So these are the sort of things you're going to be looking at when you do it, but also things like range of the aircraft. What's your link? Do you need to be looking at a different type of link? Is your link encrypted? How encrypted is it? What data are you getting down? Do you want to run something that's getting live video streams, or can you get away with not having a live video stream? Redundancy I've already spoken about, but also the environmental capability. And that's a big one that comes up with this is, does the aircraft have what it needs to have in there to have the redundancies to be able to do what it needs to do? If it's 15 Ks away and you can't see and it does have a rain shower go through, can it actually handle that rain shower, or is it going to fall out of the sky? And these are all things that CASA is going to look that you've considered before you put in your application. So as far as who's doing BVLOS now, there's quite a lot of it going on. We're seeing there's a particular agricultural company that we've worked with that managed to get an approval that is about the size of Tasmania, that covers mainland Australia in agricultural work, and they're using that for things like fence line inspections, trough inspections. They're using a lot of solar-powered aircraft that can stay up all day to do that sort of thing. Mining, it's a big thing in mining. Mining pits are much bigger than they were originally started when they were looking at drone operations, and you simply can't get from one side of the mining pit to the other or cover the entire mine site in BVLOS operations, and so they're using it quite a lot. Agriculture, obviously, fence line inspections we already spoke about. Oil and gas, pipeline detection. Pipelines tend to be straight and long, and as a result, BVLOS is a big one. So we're getting a lot of that. Also with BVLOS with upper level operations. So we're finding that if you want to climb high, VLOS isn't all about horizontal. VLOS can also be about going vertical. So we're working with a client at the moment who's doing some operations up towards 10,000 feet, and at 10,000 feet, try as you might, you simply can't see a Matrice 200. So for that sort of thing, even though the aircraft is very, very close to where the pilot's launching it, it still falls over to beyond visual line of sight. And obviously that sort of thing gives another set of challenges, but it opens up the ability to do that and go and play out there, taking out work that was once upon a time done by piloted aviation, which is now done much more efficiently by drone operations. So there's quite a lot of success in the industry of people doing it. Obviously, from what I've said, it's not an easy thing to do, but there's quite a lot of success out there in people doing these sort of operations. All right, so where to from here? Obviously, replacement of traditional piloted aviation. We're seeing that quite a lot in all of the airwork sort of operations. We're getting rid of the piloted stuff. It's just simply not cost effective to use a piloted work anymore, and it's just not safe. People don't have the appetite to do it, so we're moving away from that. Obviously, urban air mobility is all about beyond visual line of sight. So once we start to do that, and once we're running remotely piloted aircraft on longer range operations, we need to do that. Freight, we've already seen the Google drone project. We've already seen it doing beyond visual line of sight operations, and they're running through their trials in Brisbane and Canberra at the moment, and that's going to roll out a little bit further as we do it. So obviously you can't be visual line of sight when you're doing that. And another big one in Australia is your high altitude pseudo satellites. So when you're running those sort of the HARPS operations, obviously all beyond visual line of sight operations, there's a lot of scope there. It's another point about having a remote operator certificate is that if you maintain your operations, certainly what we've seen in piloted aviation is that if you try and maintain your operation in the standard operating conditions, then you fall into the crowd and you don't ever get a chance to set yourself apart. once you move into these sort of operations, you get yourself a competitive advantage. People just can't catch you. And it certainly makes you a much more preferred contractor, makes you a much more preferred tenderer. You end up becoming a much better operation. Now, just wanted to mention that there is an option that isn't EVLOS. So your option, that's not BVLOS, is EVLOS. It's a midpoint between VLOS and BVLOS. So extended visual line of sight, it's out in the MOS now. We're ready to start. We've actually got a few applications in with CASA at the moment. We're ready to roll those out. EVLOS operations have a couple of different classes, but basically with EVLOS, you're using a spotter as well as the pilot to take on the role of looking at the ground risk and the air risk. So the pilot itself is looking at flying the aircraft, and then you use a spotter to have a look at what the ground and air risks are. Depending on your technology requirements, that either requires your spotter to be able to see the ground, or in some cases, they just need to be able to see the air that the aircraft's flying in and use technology for that. So it's certainly cheaper. It's easier to obtain BVLOS. As it currently stands, it sits outside of Sora, so you don't have to do the Sora process to get it into it. And that sort of thing can be turned around relatively quickly for operators looking at doing it. It's also CASA's way of getting people to start be compliant. So they really want people to start looking at compliance, and that's one of the ways they're going to deal with it. Drawbacks of BVLOS, you've got a maximum range of 1,500 meters from the spotter. You usually need at least 2 crew for it, and your observers require training and certification. The other thing is some aircraft require the spotter, so some aircraft are just simply not appropriate for it, where they could do a BVLOS operation. So from a business feasibility point of view, costs of BVLOS approvals change depending on what you want to do. You want to go and do a Google operation, then set aside many bags of money. It's going to be expensive. So you're looking at, your starting fee for that sort of stuff. You're looking in the hundreds of thousands of dollars. But if your operation is a outback property where you're in atypical airspace, there's not much going on out there, then your cost for a BVLOS approval runs in the order of sort of $3,000 to $5,000 is what sort of price you're looking at for it to run that operation. And you're not paying that for every time you do your operation. We get an area approval, so it covers you for BVLOS approval for a particular period of time in a particular area, and then you can just continuously do your operations in that area. So it's a pretty good system. It's not, for what you get out of it, it's not overly expensive. The way Aviassist actually makes a lot of, makes our revenue out of these approvals isn't so much in what we charge you, but what we save you. So we find that by going through our process, the fees that CASA ultimately charge us compared to what they charge you are much less. So if you were to do the approval process yourself, you're going to end up paying about the same, just that all that money is going to go to CASA and you're going to have the heartache. Whereas if you go through someone like us, we get charged much less from CASA, and so that difference is what we ultimately take for that. So that's the work that we do for you. So yeah, there's a bit in it, but yeah, we can go from there. So I know the time's running along. I've gone as quick as I can. Sorry about that, but let's open it up to questions and answers if you want, Alex. I'm sure Alex will get back in a moment. So I was, when they got my slide pack, I was warned that there was a lot of content in there, and I said, no, I'm sure I can get through that in time. And I'm currently 5 minutes over, so I'm probably going to get into a bit of trouble here, but that's all right. We're going to get the questions through shortly.
No, that's all good. Thanks for that, Rowan. Just a couple of technical difficulties always when running a webinar. So I guess you kind of, before we go into the Q&A, I guess just wanted to touch on, obviously, given all the information that's been presented here, if engaging in a BVLOS approval process is something that you're interested in exploring more, please do get in touch. We have gone through a few of these processes already with some of our clients on a range of different aircraft. I think you would have seen a couple of them featured there within that slide already. Now we're looking at continuing that and bringing that to the market. So if you are interested, please do get in touch. Obviously, got our contact details. Just email info@spheredrones.com.au and we'll get back to you. Or you can give us a call now. To get into these questions, you kind of addressed one there already, Rowan. It was, if a drone operator holds an RPA and REOC, is it necessary to apply every time to CASA for permission to fly BVLOS, or can blanket permission be sought?
Beautiful. So we've addressed that, but what I will say about that though is that it's important when you look at these approvals that you look at the expiry date of your current operator certificate. CASA can't issue an instrument to you beyond the expiry date of your current instrument. So often with this sort of thing, it's good to get through to your second renewal. So your first renewal on your OC is only going to take 12 months. After that, you get extended out to 2 years and beyond, depending on your operation. And so it's a good idea to have a look at that and sometimes do things like renew your operator certificate early, pay a little bit of money to renew it early so that you're on a 2-year cycle, or if you're more advanced into your 3-year cycle. So that way, when you get your BVLOS approval, it's not going to last for 6 months, it's going to last for 3 years. So you get a bit more value out of it.
Yeah, awesome. But I guess, yeah, the point is that every time your operation changes location and aircraft, that does require a new approval process.
Absolutely. So if you want to, if you got your approval for one mine site and want to go and operate at a different mine site, you'll need to do it again. In saying that, one of the good reasons for using a professional to do the application on the first time is the way we set up your approval is make it much easier for you for next time. So your document suite is already set up, your Sora is already set up, so that next time it's about location-specific approvals, not about getting your entire operation up to that standard.
Fantastic. We'll move on because there are a few questions coming through here. There's a couple questions on BVLOS courses. Is there a course on BVLOS Tier 1 and Tier 2?
So it's not yet authorised by CASA, and unfortunately I can't say much more about it just yet because it's all part of the confidential working group, but it will be approved this year. We're just not sure when it's going to be. And they are looking at doing a Tier 1 and a Tier 2 course.
Okay, awesome. Next question. Does that mean anyone who wants to operate BVLOS over 400 feet should just go ahead and get an IRX or sit the IRX exam?
Anyone who's been involved in the regulatory change process with CASA would probably agree that it takes time, nauseatingly takes time. I'm a big fan of getting IRX because IRX is going to open up the sky regardless. So no matter what they change here, IRX is going to be bigger for you anyway. So if you can get through it, if you've got the time and energy to commit to it, and it really is one of those things you commit to, then absolutely, nothing's going to beat IRX. And one thing with IRX is even though it teaches you things that might seem irrelevant for some of your operations, it's pretty important when you're operating in advanced airspace that you understand how the aircraft that are operating that airspace are actually operating. So I'm a really big fan of that. And again, for those people in the room who have got the IRX, good on you, really good work.
Yeah, awesome, fantastic. A more straightforward one, but a good one nonetheless. What's a spotter? What do you define as a spotter?
Okay, so a spotter's not defined anywhere in the regulations. It is in the EVLOS, but in normal operations, it's not in there. So your spotter operations is just someone there that's there to help you with the safety of the operation. They're going to report back to your pilot about what ground and air risks there are. Under the EVLOS process, that's actually a certified position. So they've got to have done some training to do that. They get a certificate as a spotter, as either an EVLOS Class 1 or an EVLOS Class 2. They call them observers, and they're people that actually have a legislated duty to the operation of that, which allows the remote pilot to hand over some of their duties across to the spotter to be able to do some of those.
Great. Very detailed. The next one there is, if I own an REPL, what's the next step for me to fly EVLOS?
Next step for you to fly EVLOS if you own a REPL is, first of all, you need to have an operator certificate. The EVLOS system has been set up that it cannot operate without an operator certificate. So that's the first step. And then the next step is just give Sphere or Aviassist a call and we'll work you through the process. It's essentially paperwork, changing your manuals, putting the procedures in there, getting your system set up to be able to do it. And so I meant to mention this earlier, and I'll just quickly circle back to this. One of the things when it comes to what your cost your approvals are is going to be the quality of your manuals at the outset. We are big advocates of wherever you can, at the approval process, moving over to something like our standard document pack. So if you, instead of trying to hold on to the documents that you've got, if you move over to a standard document pack with us, then obviously it takes us a lot less time to set it up. But moreover, it takes CASA a lot less time. Our document packs have been designed so that they slip into CASA standard templates until CASA approves our next set. So we've done that intentionally so that it makes it easier for CASA when they look at your operation. If you've got something that you've butchered it or it's been around for a few years and things have changed with CASA, it's always going to cost you more money when CASA goes and tries to hunt for things rather than when CASA knows exactly what it looks like. And that's how we get some of the benefits and efficiencies for our clients is we send an approval, they say, okay, it's an Aviassist approval. We've seen this heaps of times before, we can just stamp it.
Too easy, yep. Moving on to the next one there. And excuse me for just trying to read through this one here, a few acronyms. What is the minimum number of hours of actual practical IFR/IMC experience CASA wants as part of their risk assessment BVLOS issuing process?
Beautiful. And to the person who issued that, hello, how are you doing? I would expect nothing less than a question like that from you, sir. You would absolutely meet all of them by a long way. The CASA actually doesn't say what it is. They have in the past on the flight test wanted to have people who have actually flown IF or have been around IF operations before they prime pilot. But we've seen that be as little as just the flight test and a couple of hours of training, or a day of sitting there doing some training with someone who has done beyond visual line of sight operations, and then they're comfortable with that. CASA thinks that the IRX is what it needs to be. So once you've done that, from a risk assessment point of view, they're pretty happy just to hold that, but they do want to see that you've done some BVLOS operations with someone else, and that could even be with CASA at the time of doing your approval.
And what is that IFR IMC stand for?
Instrument flight rules and instrument meteorological conditions. So they're looking at whether or not the pilot has actually flown in it. CASA's not fussed about that. They don't need us to be pilots. Obviously handy if you are, but they don't need you to be pilots at this stage. They're just happy to say you understand, by passing the IRX, you understand theoretically at least where the aircraft are going to be.
Great. Another one here, is there an age limit on pilots?
Is there an age limit on pilots? We're looking at the bottom end or the top end?
let's start bottom.
There is loosely an age limit on pilots, and it's about your ability to hold the radio operator certificate. I'd have to get back to you and check, but I think the latest of this to be able to hold everything you need is 18. We've had some students go through that earlier that they can hold part of the whole licensing package, but certainly chief pilot approvals, anything like that, you certainly need to be 18 to do that. On the top end of it, there's none. There's currently not a medical requirement in the regulations for remote pilot operations. In saying that, extended visual line of sight, they've added a requirement that you meet a Victorian driver's license medical requirement for at least your vision and a few other things. So I think we're going to see a little bit more of CASA bringing in medical requirements, which might knock some people out, not necessarily on age, but on other things. But at this stage, we're pretty good. You don't have to worry about that.
Awesome. And how long does one of the process take? There's a question here on start to finish timeline, assuming Class G, and I just continue to encourage people to enter questions in. We're probably not going to be able to get to them all, but we will follow them all up with an email and call afterwards. But yeah, how long should you expect the application?
I think everyone expects me to answer this the way that I'm going to answer it, and I'll stay true to that. I mean, lawyers have a way of doing things. I'm going to stick with that way. How long's a piece of string? Absolutely. So it's one of those difficult things. If you look, Class G airspace, if you have a really good document pack and you've got some history and you're prepared to move over to the latest templates to make things easier and drop in some stuff that we've got some stuff that we can work with straight away to speed things up. And you've got aircraft that are off-the-shelf aircraft that we've worked with before, then look, if we had everything done, then we're turning around an application in, well under a month to turn around an application if it's in the right situation. That's to get it to CASA, but that's when the term starts. And with CASA, I've had an approval there that's been there for, it's coming up to 9 months now. It is well outside CASA's terms of reference. It is a very, very, very technical one that involves Air Services Australia and the military airspace and military on the ground. It's a really, really technical operation. And so CASA, probably rightly so, have dragged their heels a little bit just to try and get their head around how this operation works. But that's an anomaly. We've had really big areas of Australia covered in BVLOS operations that we've been surprised that CASA's turned around in a matter of weeks. From application to getting it through has been a couple of weeks. So it really depends on, one, workload of CASA. If you were to apply something to CASA this week, given that coronavirus is going to affect everyone's ability to work in the office, I would say pretty soon, but also just the workload with the manual standards coming in, I wouldn't expect to be on visual line of sight to turn around in under 2 months to 3 months at the moment, unless it was a really, really simple operation. But I'm saying that for most operations in Class G airspace, I couldn't see it being anything over 3 months.
Yeah, and I guess it's obviously going to be a factor of cost as well and risk as they increase, so does time, and if they're all interrelated.
Absolutely. Yeah. And that's just, they've got a lot of work to do, and CASA charges per hour to do that. So the more expensive the approval, the longer it's going to take.
Yeah, perfect. This one's a little bit more specific and a bit curlier, but we'll go there anyway. The comment is, we only fly at night. CASA have advised us that as long as we can see the lights and the orientation of the aircraft in flight, the distance is irrelevant. We see out 6 kilometers at most. Is there a conflict emerging with EVLOS?
Okay, so wow. So the good doctor that left that one, thank you very much. That's great. So you only fly at night. There's a couple of different components to this. So obviously, visual line of sight is extended at night. The fact that you can see position lights, you can see them with a contrast, you definitely can go out further at night, and I don't think there's anyone that would argue that you couldn't. Any assertion that you could go out as long as you can see the lights and the orientation, my only concern about that is that the regs require you to meet your collision avoidance and separation requirements. Separation is not just about air, it's about ground, and so from a technical point of view, you need to be able to look at that aircraft and tell where it is over the ground. And at night, that becomes pretty difficult. And so the question comes, if you were to turn off your screen or not look at it, because in BVLOS, that's what we're required to do, could you look at that aircraft and then on a map, point to on the map where you think it is? If you could do that, then absolutely, go out to 6Ks and fill your boots. If you can't point on the map where that aircraft is, then arguably you haven't met your separation requirements to your ground risk, and in which case you might have an issue. Then again, maybe you're over a controlled ground area. There's a few arguments to go either way. As far as does it emerge with EVLOS, CASA at this stage didn't have an option till EVLOS, and so I think that things were allowed to happen, perhaps not intentionally, but because there wasn't another option. BVLOS was too hard and there wasn't anything in the regs. Now that we've got EVLOS there, I expect to see CASA starting to crack down on people. We're already seeing it with above 400-foot approvals where CASA is saying, we're going to put a distance limitation on these operations if you don't also apply for an EVLOS approval at the same time. So it's going to be an interesting space. At night, yes, I agree, you can definitely go out further, but obviously you've got to consider those other risks.
Yeah, certainly. Look, we are running a bit thin on time here. We'll try and get 2 more questions out. One, which we haven't touched on hugely, is what drones are suitable for BVLOS? Now, I can probably answer this to some degree initially. I guess,
yeah,
and correct me if I'm wrong.
From what we're seeing in the industry, we obviously there's a lot of DJI equipment running on BVLOS operations, mostly because that's what people are operating. And as we move towards things like a Matrice 300, I think we're going to see a lot more BVLOS. But given that BVLOS is about going a long way, then it's about range and endurance. And range and endurance typically, or at least in the past, has come from fixed wing aircraft. So there's plenty of aircraft that you're looking at, things like the Mavinci, even though it's got a bit of a difficult human machine interface, things like the Mavinci, Sirius, platforms like the Wingtra, but also a lot of the Dell AirTech, those sort of systems where you can get out to that range. The big limiting factor on any of that is going to be your comms link. Whereas if you can find a machine that's going to be able to operate on LTE technology or satellite technology, or even simple as going down to the 915, 920, then you're going to get a lot more link out of it, and that's going to drive your ability to fly beyond visual line of sight. The guys that are doing it in DJI are flying beyond visual line of sight technically, but they're only going out to 3, 4, 5K. So a lot of those operations could probably have been done with an EVLOS if it had existed at the time.
Yeah, great. And I guess to follow that up as well, we have gone through the pre-approval audit for a few different aircraft with Aviassist, so and constantly looking at what those aircraft are. Lastly, there's a question here on CASA's interpretation of autonomous systems versus highly automated systems.
Okay, and I'm just looking at that one. Beautiful. So to the gentleman who sent that, I haven't forgotten about your question. I'm still looking at it, and I've had a chat to CASA about this, and thank you for sending through that question. CASA, it looks like they're going to land on a really, really simple definition. It looks like the final answer is going to be at any stage in the flight, if you can hit stop flying, if you can pause the flight in some way, whether it's go into a hold or activate a return to home, that you have some controlability over the direction of the flight, then it'll be considered a highly automated system, if you can't stop the aircraft doing what it's doing, other than just activate a return to home and that's it, then that's going to be an autonomous system. There's been some discussion of whether or not the aircraft being able to only be flown in manual flight is considered acceptable. At this stage, the interpretation of the regs looks to be that it's as simple as can you take over. So taking over in manual mode, even though that's a pretty difficult situation when you're running BVLOS, would still technically get through the autonomous requirement. In saying that, whether or not it would get through the BVLOS, the new Sora requirements of BVLOS, and remembering that there are approvals out there in industry that came through before Sora that wouldn't actually make it through. Interestingly, even things like the standard operating conditions, if you run it through Sora, there are times that probably wouldn't even make it through Sora. So I think CASA is going to see a bit of a different risk appetite to those sorts of operations, but at this stage, if you can touch the controls and tell the aircraft what to do and either hold it or navigate it, then it won't be considered an autonomous system.
Sorry, just jumping back in there.
Yep. No, you're right, mate.
We've still got quite a few people on the webinar, Rowan. So if you've got, maybe
I've got
we can
time to
stick
stay around. If
another
anyone's
10
got
minutes.
questions, I'm more than happy to stay around for a bit. That's fine.
Yeah. All right. Well, we might just run through a few more of these because there's some great ones coming up here. There's one here on. There's a few actually on the RX exam still. Would it be realistic just to get a recreational pilot license for a manned aircraft, for example, instead of doing the RX exam?
Yeah,
Would
that
it
wouldn't
cover
count.
the same
So,
thing?
yeah, it has to be. So CASA's minimum standard for BVLOS at this stage is RX. So even a recreational pilot's license wouldn't count, because what they're looking at in particular is understanding what an aircraft's going to do as it moves from being within cloud to not being within cloud, and understanding those sort of aircraft movements. And so, unfortunately, a recreational pilot's license wouldn't count. In saying that, if you've got an option to get a recreational pilot's license, absolutely go and get one. It's a lot of fun.
Yep. And there's another one here on that regarding ex-military and qualified Shadow 200 or Scan Eagle. Is there any consideration made for those that were previously qualified?
There's not in the regs. In saying that, I would certainly suggest we would attempt a direct exemption. So there's nothing that they can bring across directly. The legislative regime doesn't allow for it. But there is no reason why we couldn't go to CASA and look for a specific exemption for a person. So with all of this, you can always go to CASA and ask for an exemption. You can ask CASA whatever you want. And if you can meet an equivalent level of safety, CASA's essentially bound to give it to you. And so for that sort of operation, I would suggest that if part of the application pack, we do a matrix, a knowledge matrix, to show that you have learnt those items that you need to know, that you have done those sort of operations, and put it to CASA and see if they'd give you an exemption. You would certainly have a good chance of getting exemption. There's no guarantee, but the regs themselves allow for it, for them to issue an exemption, and so at least you're halfway there. And so I'd certainly give it a crack. In saying that though, if you've been flying shadows, you probably know a lot of the RX stuff anyway. You could probably get through the exam.
Yeah, and what's the cost of an RX, that whole process, including the training that you guys obviously, that Aviassist?
So the CASA fee is pretty cheap. The CASA fee is in the hundreds of dollars. There's a bunch of books that you need for it. Look, to be honest, I would have to get back to you, but I think it's in the $2,000 or $3,000 worth for a week-long course to do that sort of thing. And so the way the course is structured is you do a one-on-one or a one to a very small amount. So normally the maximum we have in the course is 2. If there are people that have got prior knowledge, we might extend that, but usually it's a maximum of 2 to 1 for the instructor ratio. It's a very, very intense week. By the end of the week, you don't want to see your instructor's face because they ride you pretty hard for it. It's the only way to get through the content. And then you go and lock yourself away for a week worth of self-study. And if you lock yourself away and you're genuine to this, then you'll get through the exam at the end of that week. If you do the course and then decide you want to have the weekend off and go to the pub, and then the next week you're going to go to work for a few days, you're just simply not going to get through the exam.
Yep, no, for sure. I can appreciate that. It's obviously a bit of a killer. This next one, obviously not in your best interest to give a certain answer, but can REOC holders get BVLOS approval on their own?
Yes, absolutely. There is absolutely no reason why you can't go and do it yourself. I don't know if it's worth the hassle. I think that ultimately you're going to end up spending the same amount of money with your CASA fees as what you would if you went through a consultancy firm. And whilst it sounds like I have to say that, that's something I genuinely believe in. So if it were me, I wouldn't take the hassle. I would just work through a consultancy firm because it's probably going to work out about the same price. And what you end up getting as your product is something that CASA's already happy with. Imagine trying to learn this whole thing from scratch. We're lucky that we've got the know-how, that we've done some of these. We've already had the falls. We've already gone through the process with CASA where we've said, okay, well that could be done differently next time. We've changed it next time. So I'd learn from our mistakes. I'd learn from our lessons. But yeah, absolutely, you can do it yourself, and you might well find it's quite a lot of fun. Contribute some time if you're going to do it that way, and really attack it. If you're going to do it yourself, be genuine, be honest to yourself about the risks. So make sure that you are not looking at this as a way of getting through the process. Sora needs to be treated as a risk methodology where you are honest about the risks, take it seriously, and there's no reason why you won't get through it.
Yeah, and I would have thought as well, by all means, if you would like to go and do it on your own, it's likely going to take longer than if you were to go
much longer. I mean, we've been working on this for a long time now, and I couldn't calculate the number of man hours that have gone in educating ourselves on how this whole system works. I don't wish that upon anyone. It's going to take you longer, but as I say, it's not that you can't do it. Whether or not it's advertising is up to you. But yeah, I would err on using a consultancy firm, and obviously I would suggest that the best one to use would be Sphere and Aviassist.
Absolutely, absolutely. There's another question here. Is it possible to get a BVLOS approval with only one command and control link?
Yes, it is. It is possible. We have to do a C3 evaluation for it. Depends. Look, it's going to depend on the airspace categorization and what the aircraft's got built into it. But yeah, absolutely. There's no reason why you can't get a BVLOS with one command and control link. I mean, you look at a lot of the DJI equipment; they're effectively running in one. There's no reason why you can't get it. You would be precluded in some of your operations where you're doing high range, long distance operations. But yeah, no, you can do it with one command and control.
Yeah, great. And look, we'll finish up with one last question here, which is referring to what's going on overseas. Do you see the remote ID FAA talk affecting EVLOS and BVLOS here in Australia?
Wow. Way to finish on a nice, easy one. Thanks for that.
Yeah.
Yes, in time. Australia is tended to always try and march to our own beat, so as to say, and so it's difficult to see exactly how Australia's going to take. We've traditionally tried to go away from anything the FAA has done. It's historic. It's always been that way. But look, anything that happens overseas is obviously going to affect us, particularly because of the Sora process. So because of that Sora, we're all working together. I think we're going to see some changes, but the biggest changes I think we're going to see in Australia from a EVLOS point of view is a voluntary adoption of ADS-B. I think that's the key change that's going to happen with BVLOS, is that and the alternate training process. But once we get to voluntary adoption of ADS-B and piloted aircrafts, and that starts to roll out, I think that'll be much more of a change than anything that's what's going on in the US.
Awesome. No, you finished on a belter there. Look, thank you so much to Rowan for taking the time, and obviously you're a wealth of knowledge, and we probably could have sat here all afternoon going through these questions, but we do have to wrap it up. We've got those questions documented here, so we'll go through and reach out to everyone individually and get back to you with some of those answers. If you are interested in exploring this further, please get in touch with us. You know, we do have a range of aircraft here that we can propose for approvals. We've got, so you can see our contact details at the bottom there, info@spheredrones.com.au, or get us on that number. So yeah, look, thank you to everyone for joining as well. I hope you found it to be valuable. It would be great to get some feedback on the webinar session, and yeah, any more questions, feel free to send them through. And yeah, obviously everyone, I'm hoping everyone's safe through this time, and yeah, hopefully we'll pass through it soon. But thank you all for your time, and forward to speaking to you in the future.
Yeah, thanks, Alex. Thanks, everyone.